So your own ignorance, my own ignorance, leads me to another important division in the study of critical thinking. When it comes to critical thinking, there are critical thinking skills and there are critical thinking dispositions. Critical thinking skills are knowing when to ask the right questions. It's being a thoughtful observer. It's understanding what a purpose is, what an inference is, what an assumption is. All of these things you can learn from reading books, attending lectures, memorizing these things. You can train yourself up with the appropriate critical thinking skills. So if you've memorized the idea that you need to get clear on whatever issue is at hand, you've memorized the idea that evidence is important in determining what's true and what's false, then you're working towards becoming skilled at critical thinking. Now you got skills. But critical thinking dispositions are the second half of that definition. Critical thinking dispositions have to do with your desire and willingness and your judgment to ask and answer those questions at the appropriate times. Dispositions are more like habits, attitudes, traits, emotions, and motivations of a good thinker. Just as much as you might have bad or good habits physically, like smoking would be a bad habit or cussing would be a bad habit, or maybe you have good habits, you also have good and bad intellectual habits, thinking habits. We all do. We're going to learn more about what they are, like cognitive biases and something called fallacies in argumentation and informal fallacies. All of us fall victim to imperfect forms of reasoning and thinking. All of us have habits of thinking wrongly in many ways. But to have the critical thinking dispositions means more than just memorizing information. It means that you are practicing with a desire to be a critical thinker, and you have the right emotions, the right attitudes, the right motivations to do so. So that leads me to your ignorance and my own. Think about this question. And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm not trying to ask a dumb question. It's a serious question, and you'll see why. Do you know everything? No, you don't. No human being knows everything. It seems like a dumb question. The reason I ask that is because it's so obvious what the answer is. But that's not how we act in everyday life. We often act as if we know everything. At least that's how some people interpret us. And most of the time, if we're being honest, we can acknowledge that sometimes we act like we know something when we really don't. We don't know everything. But you can be even more specific. Do you know everything about your favorite subject? Most of you are going to answer no. Sometimes I had one student raise his hand and said, yeah, he knows everything about his favorite subject. Inevitably, I get that sometimes. And I asked him what his favorite subject was, and he was a mechanic, and he said Chevys. He knows everything there is about Chevys. And as he raised his arm up like this, he had the Chevy emblem tattooed on himself. And so it was funny. We got a laugh out of it. But in reality, he doesn't know everything there is to know about Chevys, and you don't know everything there is to know about your favorite subject or whatever it is you happen to be interested in. Now, can you acknowledge that? If you can acknowledge that, number one, you don't know everything, but also that what you currently believe, the current opinions that you have, if you can recognize that they might be wrong, you're on the path to having some important critical thinking dispositions. Every one of us has imperfect knowledge. This is obvious, but that's not how we often act. And the degree to which you can recognize that some beliefs you hold today, some opinions you have right now, the degree to which you can acknowledge they might be wrong is the degree of intellectual humility you have. And intellectual humility is sometimes referred to as a critical thinking disposition, but it's more readily recognized as an intellectual virtue. An intellectual virtue is another subject, and intellectual virtues make a part of who you are as a person. They make up your character. And this is how critical thinking, or the discussion of critical thinking, blends into the discussion of character, who you are as a person, both morally, intellectually, civically, and many other ways. So critical thinking has two major divisions. There are critical thinking skills, pretty easy to learn, and there are critical thinking dispositions, not so easy to learn because they involve habitually practicing the same thing over and over again until it becomes a part of you. So, for example, and this is the last thing I'll say on this segment, if you memorize a bunch of good questions that good critical thinkers ask, you memorize them. When you first start to use them in discussions, you might be trying to memorize or recall them in the middle of the conversation, in the middle of debate, because it's not yet a part of who you are. It's something you know you need to do, you want to do it, you know what to do, but you hadn't gotten used to it yet. You're still practicing. But over time, the more you keep these questions in mind, the more you use them and engage in argumentation and debate in the right way, the more they become just a part of who you are, and you naturally begin to think like that. It becomes automatic. Then you have critical thinking dispositions. So we've got a lot to discuss when it comes to critical thinking. Dispositions and skills and virtues and issues and evidence and all kinds of things. But it's going to become clear to you that all of this is very relevant to everyday life, no matter whether you're going to be a truck driver or a philosopher, psychologist, historian, or archaeologist. It doesn't matter. Critical thinking is important for you as a father, as a son, as a family member, as a community member, and as a citizen of this country. Critical thinking is something that enables your own human flourishing and will only do good in developing your well-being.